Hi, it's Eric from Real World Readiness. Today we're going to talk about something that is, in my opinion, one of the most likely potential causes of societal collapse or a long-term SHTF type situation. And that is electromagnetic pulses and solar events like flares and coronal mass ejections. Now, both of these events are what I call low probability, high consequence events. It's not likely that any of these events will happen any given day or year or even decade. But if they do, it's very high consequence and will have drastic effects to anybody that's affected by them. Today's show is going to be a little bit less about how to prep for these events and a little bit more just background on the events and what to expect if they do occur, how to recognize them, and also a little bit about how likely they are and what the actual effects will look like in the real world, especially with EMPs. And when I say EMP, I mean a man-made, human-caused electromagnetic pulse attack. Solar events are natural events. EMPs I'm treating as man-made events, although the effects of both are very similar. What an EMP is a burst of electrical energy that can knock out power grid, it can damage electrical components, it causes all kinds of disruption to electrical circuits. Generally, they result from a high altitude detonation of a nuclear device at 250 miles or more above the Earth's surface. A nuclear device is detonated and that generates electromagnetic pulse in the Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field that can cascade down onto ground level and cause electrical effects at ground level. If we were to experience an EMP in North America, a nuclear airburst at 250 miles or more over the center of the continent, the effects would probably affect the entire continental United States. And they could include everything from a total grid failure, like lights out, power's out, it's not coming back on, transformers are fried, power buildings are fried, cars won't start, your phone's fried out, your computer's burned out, all electronic devices are wiped. That's your worst case scenario. But that's the effect of it, because the pulse comes through into the circuits at ground level and overloads them with voltage and basically burns out the components. Even if certain areas of the country are affected less than others, especially when it comes to the power grid, cascading effects from the grid failure could cause widespread outage even if there wasn't damage in a particular region. A great example of this is just a few months ago in Spain and Portugal. They had an event where their grid system got overloaded and then each successive grid failed trying to make up for the next one until all of a sudden the entire country of Spain was without power for a few days. And that's kind of what we'd see here, except that an EMP would damage the components and the power wouldn't come back on until they were replaced. Modern vehicles could be destroyed by EMPs as well. Not physically destroyed, but their electronics fried so that the computer's not working, so the engine doesn't run. Now you can't start it, you can't unlock it, you can't do anything with it, it's just a lump of metal. Same thing for personal electronics. Things that are attached to long wires are at more risk. That's why the grid is almost certainly going to be damaged in the event of an EMP, because it's just nothing but long copper wires that pick up that signal and magnify it and shoot it through all the components, frying them, burning them out. So items that are turned off or unplugged are more likely to survive an EMP than items that are on, in use, or charging, or hooked into the grid itself. So if you have things that you're saving for, or that you're relying on for your preps, keep them unplugged. Don't leave something plugged in all the time, because if there is an EMP, it's less likely to be destroyed if it's not connected to the long wires in the grid. Now, what I've just said is the worst case scenario. The complete blackout of the United States, no power, transformers are fried, power's not coming back for a long time, months or years. That's the worst case. That's a controversial statement though. There are a lot of people who will tell you that an EMP is nothing to worry about, that it's just going to be a temporary loss of some systems, that it can't destroy everything, that it's not going to destroy much of anything at all. And the truth is, we really don't know. We haven't experienced in the modern world an EMP attack against a modern industrialized nation with electronics. So a lot of it is speculation, a lot of it is theory, a lot of it hasn't been tested. There have been a few tests done though, and we're going to go through those here real quick. The one I found the most interesting out of all of them was a U.S. Army test done in 2004 called Loyalty, the Loyalty tests. And in this test in 2004, the Army took 37 civilian vehicles, just stock off the lot, nothing special done to them, just regular Toyotas and Fords and Chevys and just the things that we drive day to day, and exposed them to simulated EMP effects. Now I don't know how they did that, but they simulated the effects of an EMP attack airburst like we were talking about, and they found that 0 of those vehicles were disabled. None, not one. Some of them stopped running, they shut down, but would start back up again when the event was finished. Some of them had weird effects like the lights are flashing or the turn signals wouldn't work or odd things like that. But again, all of those vehicles recovered. So out of the 37 vehicles they exposed to EMP, all of them recovered. So this is not a real EMP, it was a simulated one, so there's room for error there. But it does lead me to think that probably you're not looking at a complete 100% loss of everything if we do experience an EMP attack, which is good to know. Another one, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in 2010 did a study called Electromagnetic Pulse Effects on Power Grids. And I'll put a link to that one down in the description. I have a link to the study if you want to look at it more in depth. But they did an assessment using scientific principles to see what they thought the effects of an EMP attack against North America would be. Again, this was in 2010. And they found that large transformers and power infrastructure was almost certainly going to be damaged, severely, need to be replaced, damaged. So they predicted large damage to the grid. They said that the damage would depend on location of the facility, shielding of the facility, because you can shield against EMPs, and a lot of military and government targets are hardened and shielded against it. So are some power plants nowadays. But if it was shielded more, depending how it was oriented compared to magnetic fields, the damage to the grid systems would be variable. They also found that consumer technology was less vulnerable, specifically your phones, your solar generators, all the various small electronics that we use throughout our day was less vulnerable, especially if it was turned off and especially if it was disconnected from the grid, it was unplugged. So from their findings, I would figure that we are likely to see massive power loss, especially since the grid in the United States is old and it's not well maintained. We've got a lot of things to replace. I know some of the power poles that burned up in the LA fires were installed in the 1920s. They were still in service. They're still using the wires installed in the 1920s. So a lot of our equipment is old and out of date. So it is likely that if we were to sustain an EMP event, we would lose power. It would probably cascade failures even through areas that were not affected directly, and it's likely that a major EMP attack, you'd see a long-term loss of power, like long-term, like months to years long-term to repair. So what do we have for real-world examples of EMPs from nuclear weapons? Well, not much at all. The best known one is a nuclear test in 1962, July of 1962, called Starfish Prime. Yes, that's the real name of the test. I'm not making that up. That's what the government called it. In the Starfish Prime test, the Army detonated a 1.4 megaton blast 250 miles above the surface of the Earth, 900 miles from the Hawaiian Islands, to specifically generate an EMP pulse. They didn't anticipate that it would affect Hawaii, but it did. It affected Honolulu. Again, remember, this is 1962. This is pre-electronics. Almost everything's solid state. Cars don't have a computer in them, nothing like that. The EMP from Starfish Prime knocked out street lamps. It damaged electrical equipment like transformers. There were power outages and just overheated circuits. It caused a lot of noticeable damage in Honolulu in the 60s. All of it was repairable. Nothing was lasting for very long. They fixed everything, and it was a limited scope. But the thing to remember that is that in the 60s, obviously, we weren't nearly as dependent on electronics. Power stations were solid state. There were no computers running the grid. There were no switching computers. The computers weren't running the airports. Computers weren't running the distribution centers. Registers were not electronic. Cars were not electronic. All of these things. And this was a relatively small yield weapon compared to modern weapons. So that backs up kind of what we're saying here, and then I think that EMP will have noticeable effects. 900 miles is a pretty good chunk of distance away. Now, it's still closer than the spread east coast to west coast United States. But again, this was a much harder target in terms of electronics vulnerability than modern America is. It's pretty scary stuff. But before you get too worried, there are some reasons why this isn't likely to happen. Number one, why this is a low probability event, is that most countries don't have the technology to do this. You have to have a big enough bomb to actually do a pulse. You have to have a missile technology to get it to 250 miles to an accurate location and detonate where it's supposed to be. You have to do all that without us knowing you're doing it and without the US figuring out who did it afterwards, because it's almost a guarantee if you were to use a nuclear EMP attack against the United States or another Western power, a nuclear response is almost certainly going to respond. And most countries, most nation states, are not going to deal with that. Most terrorist nations, or terrorist groups, are not really going to have the technology and the ability to do this. So the chances of this actually happening are pretty slim. It's not impossible, but it's pretty slim. So don't stress too much about it. Okay, that's man-made attacks, deliberate EMPs. To me, the bigger threat is actually a solar EMP, a solar event causing magnetic and electronic disruption to our infrastructure and our society. The effects of a solar EMP are basically the same as those of a nuclear one. So all the things we talked about, the grid cascading failures, burned out transformers, electronic circuits not working, all that is also in play with a solar event. But a solar event is capable of a much higher energy and much more likelihood of damage than a man-made nuclear event is. The other thing with solar events is they're a naturally occurring phenomenon. They have happened, they will happen again, and we know that that's a fact on there's no debate. There's no doubt at all that at some point in the future we'll have another major solar event. It's a matter of when and how prepared we are for it and how much warning we'll have for it. Basically, there's two things we got to worry about. You have solar flares and coronal mass ejections. The solar flare is the less dangerous of the two. Now, they can both happen at the same time. They can simultaneously hit, or they can be generated on the sun by the same event very close in time. So you may have a solar flare and then a CME, or a CME and a solar flare at the same time or closely following each other. But generally, they're two separate kinds of events. A solar flare is a sudden burst of radiation out of the sun. You can physically see it. It looks like a flare shooting out of the sun. It takes 8 minutes from the time it leaves the sun to the time it strikes the earth. And it's generally a fairly short duration and localized effect. Solar flares don't really do an EMP effect. They do more, they interfere with the magnetosphere. They mess up radio communications and satellites and GPS and things like that. So their effect on us is not nearly as bad as an EMP event would be. But they can be pain in the rear when you're trying to use a shortwave radio, for example, or any kind of communications between satellites. They can cause that to go down. The real player is a coronal mass ejection, or a CME. And this is the one that really scares me. This is the one that is a worrier to me. What a CME is a glob of plasma and a magnetic field that breaks off from the sun and is thrown out into space. It's a longer term event, but it's slower moving. It takes 1 to 3 days for it to get here. So theoretically, they could see it coming and give us up to 3 days warning, hey, there's a CME going to hit the earth. The big one though, the one that really drives home how serious this should be taken, was an event called the Carrington effect in September of 1859. So over 100 years ago. Almost 200 years ago now. Anyway, an astronomer named Carrington saw this one coming, and then it affected the entire world. It was a massive CME event, 3 to 5 times bigger than the one that I just talked about that hit Quebec City. And it affected the entire globe. It was big enough and long enough that as the globe spun, the whole globe got caught up in this coronal mass ejection as we were traveling through it. It caused noticeable effects. You could see the aurora borealis as far south as Cuba. It was because the aurora borealis, the northern lights, is magnetic waves hitting the Earth's magnetosphere, and that causes the aurora borealis. And it was so much energy that you could see the northern lights with the naked eye all the way down to Cuba. Compasses were affected. Compasses wouldn't track north, they'd just spin. This is all over the world. Compasses just stopped pointing north. They just pointed at random directions or continually spun. They didn't have a lot of technology in those days. Electricity wasn't really a thing. They didn't have any electronics, obviously, in the 1850s. They did have telegraphs. And there was so much electrical energy in the air that telegraph lines caught on fire. Telegraph keys caught on fire. You could disconnect the telegraph key from power and send a signal to the next town. It was so much energy that it was literally burning the lines. People didn't know what they were seeing. Some people thought it was Judgment Day. Some people thought it was who knows what. But they did eventually figure out that it was from the sun. It was a coronal mass ejection. If we were to get something like a Carrington effect today, it could be devastating. This is much bigger energy than an EMP bomb like we're talking about from a missile. It's orders bigger. It will almost certainly knock out the grid to such an extent that it would take months to probably years to recover. A lot of people will tell you that it'd be the end of civilization. We're back to the Stone Age. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think we would slowly be able to rebuild. But especially if you live in not a major metro area, if you live in a rural area or a smaller country, or basically not any of the major centers of population, I think that you would seriously be looking at years before you had electricity wired back into the grid again. It could be a long time. Part of the problem is these transformers, they're big, they're expensive, they take a long time to manufacture. We don't have them on hand. Most power companies don't have enough to replace the ones that they own. And if every transformer in the country, or most transformers in the country, blow at the same time, to replace them, you have to build them. To build them, you need electricity. To have electricity, you need to have some transformers to build the grid. It all cascades down. So the supply of new parts, the transportation of new parts, all of that becomes really, really difficult. So as you build the grid, it becomes easier, but especially in the initial phases, getting things back up and running and getting parts to build it, that's really the big hang up. You can fix it all day long, but you got to have the parts to do it. And it takes time. And there's a lot of transformers in the world. So that's really your main threat there. So how often does this happen? That's the big question, isn't it? Because a natural occurrence, you don't know. Like I said, up to 3 days warning. That's how long out we know this is coming. So it could happen 3 days from now, it could happen tomorrow, it could happen in 100 years. In general, scientists believe that a coronal mass ejection like the Carrington event is probably around 20 to 100 years that it happens in the vicinity of the Earth, which means that we're probably due for another one because it's been over 100 years since the last one. But again, it doesn't work like that. It's not a precise guess. It's kind of random, but that's roughly how long we are between events. So we're due for a Carrington-style event. In fact, in July of 2012, a Carrington-size coronal mass ejection happened and missed the Earth by 4 days. That is to say, the CME came out from the sun, the Earth came by into its path. 4 days later, the CME was where the Earth was 4 days ago. If we were 4 days slower in our orbit, we'd have had it in 2012. We'd be having a whole different conversation right now. We'd be living in a whole different world right now. Okay, so what can we do knowing these things are out there and these things may happen in our lifetimes? Well, it's a lot to go into. We're not going to get all into this video, but you want your power outage preps, your water preps, and your food preps. All three of those things are going to be the things that you need. Like I said a million times in these videos, these are building blocks. If you have your basics covered, a lot of scenarios are going to be helped by having those basics covered, and this is one of them. Now, it's going to be potentially a long-term thing if one of these things hits. So chances are your preps won't last long enough for the duration of the event. If it's months or years, it'd be ideal if they did, but let's be honest, probably not for most of us. But what it will do is buy you some time to adjust to the new situation, work with your communities, work with people you know, work with yourself and your own resources, see what you can do and try and pull together and get through this crisis that you're going to face if these things happen. Another thing to be aware of is that if you do face a major societal collapse like this, a major event, SHTF, everything fell apart, you can't communicate to the next county, barely talk to your neighbor without walking over to talk to them. Unfortunately, you need to be prepared for a certain amount of collapse of law and order. You need to be aware that there are going to be desperate people doing desperate things, and you should probably have a plan to ensure your safety and your security and the security of your loved ones and the things that you've put aside to take care of them. I've said before, and I'll say again, lone wolf is a fantasy for books. You're probably not going to survive in a very unruly, lack of law and order, desperate people trying to feed their kids scenario by yourself. You can't guard 24/7 and do all the other work you're supposed to do that you're going to have to do to survive on your own. It's very important, if you think something like this has happened, one of the first things I would do, if the lights all go out, the cell phones don't work, my car won't start, I'm thinking, okay, I think I know what this might be. If it's not rectified within hours, by the time the morning comes around, I'm going to start knocking on neighbors' doors and say, hey, here's what I think happened. Let's have a neighborhood meeting. Let's see what we can do to deal with this. And try and get the people that you live with, that you live around, on the same page so you can share responsibilities. You'll have more skills to draw from. You'll have more manpower to draw from for doing the manually intensive work that we'll have to do without electricity. And you'll have more people to draw from for security purposes. You can maybe man a checkpoint into your cul-de-sac. You can maybe keep an eye on the highway that's 2 miles over there and see what's coming down it. You can Send people out to go looking for deer. Maybe you got some hunters in your neighborhood. You can go, long story short, you're going to need to build a community. You're probably not going to make it on your own if society falls all the way apart. There are a couple of books I recommend reading. They're fiction, but they're both a really good read, and they're two of my favorite books, actually. Both of them are written about modern Americans surviving after an EMP event. It doesn't go into a lot of details about what happened, but it's how they survived. The first one is Lights Out by David Crawford. This one's set in Texas, in a suburb of, I think, San Antonio. I can't really remember, but it's a good book. It has a lot of technical information. Not technical exactly, but things that make you think about what you'd not have without power. And it has a lot about building community to survive. It's also got all kinds of storylines that are fun to read. Anyway, that's a good book. Read that one. The second one I couldn't find my copy of. I think I loaned it to somebody and never got it back. It's called 1 Second After by William Fortschner. And that one I like even better because it goes in a lot more detail about what you're not going to have and effects on modern institutions without power, without electronics, without communication with other cities, how much of what you depend on for your life comes from other parts of the country. And I think it has a pretty good read on what would happen to society and people trying to survive in a world where suddenly the electric carpet was yanked out from under us. Again, both are fiction. Both are probably a little more extreme than real life would be. Both are a good read. I'll put a link to both the books down in the description. I'm not an Amazon affiliate or anything, just books that I think that you might enjoy. And I think these two books in particular will give you a good feel and get your mind working to help you get yourself prepared for what you might need to deal with if something like this were to happen. Last thing, these things are scary, okay? If these things happen, it's a major, major world-changing, life-changing event. But don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Just live your life. Prepare reasonably, prepare practically, but don't spend your days being afraid of this, because chances are good, like I said, these are low probability events. High consequence, they do happen, it's going to be a game changer for everybody on the planet. But they're not likely to happen on any given day. You're probably not going to have to deal with this. Don't let this consume you. Don't let this take over your thoughts. Don't prep specifically for this necessarily, because this is not the thing that you're most likely to have to deal with. But when you're making your other preps, think about these kind of things and think, hey, if I do this and make that a little better, I can do this more long term. Or what if I can't get power long term? Well, does this still work? If that won't work, what else can I do? And also, don't let the perfect get in the way of the possible. Do what you can. Anything that you do is better than none. If you can buy yourself a few months, 6 months even, would be fantastic, where you don't have to worry about your basic life necessities if the modern world turns off. That gives you time to figure out what to do after that 6 months. If the world turns off and 3 days later you're desperate, you're in a bad spot. But if you prepared ahead of time for all these other things, for power outage, for flooding, for evacuation, for water issues, whatever you've been planning for, those things will help you get through the initial days of something like this to the point where you can figure out how to get through all of it. So don't be afraid. Don't work from a place of fear. Work from a place of readiness, a place of hope. Work from a place of, I can do this. Yeah, I'd rather be ready for it than not. But don't obsess about it. That's what I'm saying. All right, that's about all I got on this for now. I would love to hear what you think down in the comments. If you got anything to add, anything that is relevant that you've thought about for preparations wise, if I'm right or I'm wrong about any of the information I gave. Some of this stuff I just learned to make this video, so I may have got a few details wrong. If I did, let me know down in the comments. I love hearing from you guys, and I check my little channel thing and I see I got comments from you guys. It always brings a smile to my face, and I go immediately and try and answer as many of them as I can get to. So yeah, let me know what you think. Love to hear from you, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay safe, stay ready.